Hey guys, I'm Nashwa. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm doing another collaboration. And this is one that I've been really interested in and excited about because I'm here today with Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. I actually have to read it off the screen because I didn't want to get it wrong. Scott, and their channel is very new to me. I discovered them, I think, a couple of months ago. And somehow, for some reason, they only have around 250 subscribers, which it doesn't make sense to me why their channel is so small. So hopefully through this video, you'll discover how great they are, and then you can, subscribe to them. So welcome to my channel, guys. I've had a lot of fun watching your videos, and if you can just introduce yourselves and your channel and what you do on there.
Thank you for having us first.
Yeah.
We're excited to do this. So I guess we're husband and wife, which I think is, might be obvious.
Otherwise, why would I put up with him?
Okay, well, we sort of read, I don't know, like lots of genres in the adult fiction. We talk about it. We don't take ourselves too seriously. And
yeah, it sort of started as wanting to have more people than just our book club to talk books with. Scott gets to read quite a lot during his day because he audiobooks while he does delivery driving for our business. And I've always been the reader in the household, and he's sort of overtaken me just because he can read so many books in a week, now. So we needed to sort of broaden our circle and get some more people who we could talk books with. And so all of a sudden we're on BookTube, and it is, I don't know if everyone says this, but it's the best community. And I can't imagine not doing this as part of our sort of weekly stuff that we do.
Yeah.
Now. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds, because I also try not to take myself too seriously, because I feel like that defeats the point of being, like, I don't want to pretend to be an academic talking about things, because sometimes, like, I don't know what I'm talking about. It's just me and my opinion, on the internet in general, because, I feel if I talk about Pakistani fiction, a lot of people tend to get offended. And I usually preface it with, I'm not an expert. Like, this is just what I think. So I think that's why I like the channel's vibe. Like, I think it's just great that, two people just having fun conversations about books.
Yeah, I think if you put yourself out there as an expert, sooner or later, somebody's going to come along smarter than you and point out why you don't know what you're talking about.
But also, I think that there's this real, like, almost imposter syndrome among booktubers where we all say, oh, I'm not an expert, you don't have to be an expert to enjoy and think about literature. That's not the point. The point is that, it should be accessible to everyone, and we have this great tool in the internet to make this conversation much broader than we have access to in our neighborhoods.
And most people read for joy anyway.
So it's not about knowing it all. It's
whether
about
you understand Moby Dick doesn't really make a difference as to,
And I'm going to get something different from Moby Dick than you are, and,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if I ever read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had that book for about 15 years, I think, and I've never read it. I just have it for a later time, but for somehow in those 15 years, I haven't come up with a later time. Like, there's no perfect time for it yet. Just haven't.
I think, just go to your Wikipedia and search for whales, and that's Moby Dick there.
Read about whales.
That's sort of what Melva's done.
I've got to say, it has gotten pushed down the list after watching Scott read it, because he was so frustrated.
I'd say there for another 20 years until I'm 45, and I'm like, okay, maybe now I should find it. So when I initially reached out to you guys, firstly, thank you for accepting. But what we wanted to talk about today was general fiction in general, but sharing a little bit about Pakistani fiction and what I've been reading. So if there's any specific questions about Pakistani fiction that you have, or should I just go into an explanation about it?
Well, I think one of the series we do on our channel is we sort of put a spotlight on a country that our viewers might not have read a book from, or only read one or two books on, and come up with a couple of books to recommend in that series. So most recently we did the Philippines, where we recommended 4 books from the Philippines. So I think that just getting some general recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's really the place to start. I think, especially, I think we take for granted about our own, when reading in our own language, that we understand almost the history of our literature. We know who William Shakespeare is, and we know who Dickens is, and who the big important names are. But when you're entering another culture, you don't always have those cultural landmarks to go, oh, well, that's, I better read someone by, something by this person because they did whatever they did,
Yeah. So I think one thing that I do on my channel is I discuss Pakistani fiction in English, because we have a multitude of languages and our national language is not English, it's Urdu. So a lot of our literature is concentrated in Urdu, and it's one of those languages that we know how to speak, we know how to read and write, but after you're 16 years old, you are not required to either study it. Our entire university is in English, and then our professional careers are conducted in English. So you sort of lose touch with the great works of your time, especially because they're in a different language. And over the years, you feel less inclined to pick up an Urdu book because it just keeps getting harder and harder. So that's why I stick to English fiction, because I don't have a great grasp over the great Urdu works of our time, because there really are some wonderful works out there. And right now I'm intimidated by them, because I feel like it would really be going back into studying a language that I speak on a daily basis. I read it, I can read it, but it's one of those languages which is so pure, and I don't know how to describe it in a way that it has a different feeling. And a lot of things that get translated are very lackluster. Like they lose a sense of, the beauty of the language is lost in translation. So that's why so far in this year, I'm trying to only tackle Pakistani English fiction. So that's the first thing that I would want you to clarify, because the books that I talk about, they're not representative of the entire country or the entire history of our literature, because there's so much that I'm not talking about, because I don't feel equipped to talk about it. But next year, I'm planning to get into a little more of that and try to read some of Urdu books and maybe talk about them in a bilingual sort of way. So that brings me to English fiction, which is somewhat of a modern phenomenon, because we haven't had a lot of writers write in English before, let's say, 1950s, and our Urdu fiction has existed for a much longer time. So it's much newer. And one of the books that I always recommend to people, actually it's right behind me, it's this one. It's called Ice Candy Man by Babsi Silva.
Haha!
You guys have it? Yes.
It just arrived yesterday in the post.
Oh my God, that's amazing. It's one of my favorite books because it talks about the history of how our country was made. I don't know how much you guys know, but it was basically supposed to be the liberation of India, like India as a whole country from the British. And back then the Muslim leaders were like, well, that's not really going to work because the Muslims are a minority anyway. So they need a separate country where they can sort of practice religion and they can be, protected by laws. And that led to a process of creating this new country, Pakistan, out of nowhere. Like it took a lot of political maneuvering and discussions, and suddenly we have this new country. But what happens is when you try to divide a country like India on a religious basis, there's a lot of violence, and it was just a gruesome part of our history where millions of people basically had to cross borders from one side to the other to fit in with where they belong with their religions. So this book basically captures that history really well. And in a lot of ways, it humanizes the process. Because a lot of the times, we read about our partition and we read about it in a very technical sort of way, that this meeting was held and this conference was held and these are the points that, the leader presented. This talks about the people, and it's narrated from the point of view of a 7-year-old child. So the 7-year-old is giving you a point of neutrality. And that's one of my favorite books. That's one of the best things that I like about this book, because it puts a picture which doesn't really paint any specific person as bad. It's just, it is what it is, and then you get to decide who are the villains, who are the good people. So yeah, that's why it's one of my absolute favorite books from this year that I've read.
I love.
Sounds so good.
Every time I recommend a book like this, I feel so much pressure, because what if you end up hating it? But I'm hoping for the best.
I mean, really, because in the Australian sort of academic, learning about partition and your history is not a big part of our education at all. So to learn from sort of a humanistic point of view from fiction about periods of history, I love learning about periods of history like that, because I think it gives you the richest sense of the people equation, not the dates and the meetings and all of that sort of thing. I think historical fiction is a real gateway into the human experience of those important times that have shaped how we live and how our countries deal with and each other and interact. And it's completely, you have to be conscious that it's fiction, but I do think that it's a more emotional way to engage with that sort of subject matter.
I think, like, in war, there's no good guys and bad guys. It's way more complicated than that. And having that done through like a 7-year-old sounds so fantastic, because 7-year-olds don't judge people; they just observe. So, and also, I love books with little kids in them. You know, like adult books with little kids, and it's just because you have to barrack for somebody, and it's so easy to barrack for a little kid. You know,
Scott loves a precocious child as well. Like.
Yeah, I love it when the kid tells the adults off. Like that's my favorite. But,
yeah, and a lot of people who I've discussed this book with, they're like, "Oh, we don't like child narrators," and I'm like, "No, trust me, you'll like this one," because people compare The Book Thief. Was it like a child narrator who was not? I mean, I haven't read that book, but I've heard that the child narrator didn't really work for a lot of people, and people have told me that even though they didn't like books like Room, I think it's by Emma Donoghue, which is also by a child narrator. They're like, we were expecting something like that. And this was completely different. And now I feel like the publishers should really start paying me for all this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why we have the book based on your recommendation on your channel.
So but I read like a couple of other books. There was a book that I read, I think it's a 2018 release. It's called Melody of a Tear. Melody of a Tear is a 2018 release, and I found it really interesting because one of the things that I don't like about Pakistani fiction is that they pander to a Western audience, and it's something that I cannot relate to. So there's books like Home Fire by Kamila Shamsi. I don't know if you've read it, but it won the Women's Prize for Fiction a couple of years ago. And it's basically a retelling of Antigone from the Greek mythology, but they've like infused it with a terrorist plot, which is something that our country is known for, and not in the best way. And because it won such a big prize, everyone's like, "Oh yes, we read Pakistani fiction," and that's not really representative of us. I'm not saying that we haven't had issues like that in the past, but to just parade a book that's about a terrorist attack, that takes away from so much of our history and so much of our culture and other issues that we have. Like, there's not always like bombs going off in every part of the city. And I feel like sometimes we're represented in Western media in the worst kind of way. Like, they don't even get the language right. So like, everything already works against us, like the media and shows like Homeland. They kind of work against us because it feels like they don't do their research. And when you have a Pakistani writer, like sort of feeding into that, it doesn't really feel genuine. So that's one of my issues with Pakistani fiction, that it always seems like it's very political for a certain audience, and the local reader is just like, no, what are you kind of talking about? And one of the things that they tend to explore in fiction is, because we practice prohibition. It's a law that came in 1978. So there's like a lot of focus on drinking and alcohol in our books, which is something that I really dislike, because it shows cultural rebelliousness, which is fine, but again, that's not it, right? Like, there's so much other things to write about alcohol in your books, and every book is about like a party culture, and there's booze and everything, and it just gets exhausting after a while, because we don't want to read about that stuff. Like, we want good fiction with like real people and stories that I can relate to as a person living in this country. And one other thing that I don't like about it is, like, I live in the capital, and I've never read a book that's based here. It's so strange that I have never read a book that's based in my cities. So this city was made in the 60s from a hill. Like, they flattened the hill, they made a new city and turned it into the capital. So a lot of our cities are like historical from the British India. A lot of our books are also set there because that's where the publishing houses are. So like, because we're a smaller market, I feel frustrated with the fact that our city has never been represented in fiction.
That's frustrating.
That's weird. But I feel like Pakistan and Australia might have something in common, because they made Canberra to be the capital of Australia, and it wasn't.
It's not a...
They were arguing whether it should be Melbourne or Sydney, and they dropped a pen on the map and they moved it to the closest town, and then they moved all the politicians and all the infrastructure.
It's halfway between Melbourne and Sydney, which are the biggest cities, and basically the only people there are politicians.
But it's the same sort of thing, like it's a made city, and it's actually a really cool city to visit, actually. But yeah.
With an excellent zoo.
But it doesn't get spoken about. If you ask people who aren't from Australia, they'll tell you Sydney or Melbourne is the capital. And I mean, it's the same with Pakistan? Is it like, does everybody say like Lahore is the capital or something like that? But also going back to what you said before, from a Westerner trying to read about Pakistan, I want to know what it's like I want to know the day-to-day. I want to know what you guys have for breakfast and
all the
little minute details, just to get a feel for I want to know what are the little things that are different that, does your clothes cost twice as much as they do here, but your food is half the price? Just tiny things that would make it different to live.
The books as travel sort of scenario, and in a way that you can't actually travel, because I can go to Pakistan, but I'm always going to be a white person experiencing Pakistan as an outsider. Whereas a book gives you that really impossible experience of looking through the eyes of a Pakistani, and if they're not doing that, then
yeah. One of the things that happens,
that's what I want to read, and
you don't want to go to another country and then when you eat, they go, "Oh, you're a Westerner. You like hamburgers. These are hamburgers." You don't want you want to eat. You want to eat the food that is prepared wherever you go, because you want to experience the culture. So I feel like that's the same if they're producing books about what Westerners think Pakistan is. Firstly, as a Westerner, I can tell you that I couldn't trust any of our media when it comes to Pakistan being represented.
Yeah, that's very true.
It's so biased and agenda and horrible.
But I do think it's really interesting how publishing houses clearly have this idea of what we already think, and that we want an echo chamber. There's obviously this idea that that's what will sell. And I mean, as someone who spends a lot of money on books, that's not what I would buy.
But are we
are we the minority in that thought process?
I think booktubers in general read 10 to 20 times the books that a casual reader would read, who might be 4 or 6 books a year. Do they just want to pick up a book that they know that they like, and they want to, if Pakistan's in it and they think that there's terrorists, they go, "Oh, it's a thriller." Is that the sort of...
Yeah, I guess. And then there are people who watch, what was that show that you mentioned before? Homeland, which I've never seen because that's not my thing. But it's obviously got a following. Are they trying to pick up on the people who are TV watchers?
I don't know.
Weirdos.
And yeah, it's definitely you feel like the publishing houses are catering to that particular mindset because they do want to sell a book. Because some of the books that have won these literary prizes in the international community, it's we find it very strange and frustrating that we know that, if I was to write a book, I would know how to make it marketable. Let me throw in a popular incident that happened in the last couple of weeks. For example, if it would be some sort of violence, okay, I've checked that box. How about I make it seem like I'm smarter than I am, a little more pretentious, and I check that. And if I write in a specific way, then it's bound to get attention. But I feel like that's not genuine. So there's a book of short stories that I'm currently reading. It's called In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. And it's one of the best books because it really talks about a certain mindset in terms of how the poor live and in terms of how, life is on the farms, because you also don't want to just read about the cities. You kind of want to get into it and get into the rural life of Pakistan, because our rural majority is much larger than the people in the cities. A lot of our land is basically used for agriculture. So reading stories like that is also really interesting. But it's a really good book of short stories. And another thing that I wanted to mention was that there is a Pakistani book that I got. I haven't read yet, but I'm really excited about it because yesterday I was talking to someone and they compared it to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And this book is called The Light Blue Jumper, and it's globally published. So yeah, we have like
one of my favorites, just as a fun read.
Yeah. So this has basically been published by a publishing house in Pakistan. A lot of our books are actually published in India. And once they're published there, they sort of like make it to this side of the border and they're sold here. But the Light Blue Jumper has actually been published by a local publishing house. And so far they only have 2 books that they've come out with. And I've heard like raving reviews on both of them. So books like that get me really excited because like it's not all just grim stuff, but like there are good stories that are being told. And that sort of improves my relationship, so to speak, with Pakistani fiction. Because I think you guys know that I recently reviewed a book and I gave it 1 star, and it was just, the book was bad enough, but the experience was worsened by the author because she was not having my review. I think she was trying to get me to take it down, and I was like, okay.
Terrible.
It's so, and not something that's just strange.
Yeah.
It's just very strange.
It really just sounds desperate from the author, to be honest. Like, just
Also, as a business owner, if someone gave our business a 1-star review, like our business is different and it would be normal for me to respond to that, but that's not how I would respond. Like, it's not good for business to respond like that.
gaslight the reviewer. Like, your opinion is wrong. That's dumb.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just not smart.
I feel like with the new generation of writers, like I expect stories to be not traditional TV shows. Like that's what it read like. And I think that's what she didn't like about my review essentially, was that I compared it to a TV show, which does not have any depth, doesn't have great characters, and she just wasn't happy with that. So that's my overall take on Pakistani fiction, that I've discovered great books. There's some that I definitely would not recommend, but I feel like any book that you pick up by Bapsi Sidhwa, because I've read all of her fiction books now, they would really tell you a good story. And they're very different because in some of them they have characters from her own religion, because she's Zoroastrian by faith. So some of her characters are from that community. Other times her characters are Hindus and Muslims. And other times there's a book called Water where her characters are primarily Hindus. So like with her, you get a diversity of characters and you get really different stories set in really different parts of the country. So there's The Bride, which is basically set in the city and then in the mountain area. So you get like a range of books. So for recommendations, I feel like Ice Candy Man would be my top, but any other book by this author, like you'd have at least a relevant and authentic experience.
Ooh.
Sounds awesome.
Changes my TBR every time I...
But it sounds a little bit like in Western literature, you have to dig to find what works for you. Like, there's a lot of trash that gets the marketing time, and like,
especially if you're looking at modern works, and with what you're saying, everything is the last 50 or 60 years. Well, if I look at it, only things written in the last 50 or 60 years, everything is marketed to the nth degree. And you do have to wade through that, that spin and
figure out what's actually good, and
and which authors suit what you want in a book and all that.
But it does sound like, I guess the moral is that if you read books, you have to dig. What's that, like, you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince. You have to, like,
Yeah, that's also been my experience with Western fiction, because like when I was growing up, we had certain amount of authors available to us. Like Stephen King was very popular. We didn't have like a lot of bookstores back then. There were a lot more used bookstores. So Stephen King, Jeffrey Archer, John Grisham, like the big, I feel like American names, that's what you have. And that's what you primarily associate with fiction, like Western fiction. You just think of America. You don't really think of like places like maybe, authors from the UK. And even like far and beyond, like I don't think I've ever read a book by an Australian author. Like that's just a shortcoming that I have. That I've never thought of like picking up a book. Like I've never made a conscious effort to maybe read a book by an Australian author, because the way that it's marketed, that if it's American, it's Western, and it's all encompassing of like what Western literature is. Like, you know, if it's written by a person whose name sounds white, for example, that's what Western fiction would be. But I feel like in the last couple of years, I think when I joined BookTube, which was about 2 years ago, that's when I discovered that, you know, you can pay specific attention to Black authors, because I feel like I read them but without realizing, and then their stories make a lot more sense to you, why they talk about specific things. And similarly with like authors who are like from the Latin origins, like Elizabeth Acevedo, recently discovered her and really like her work. So I feel like the diversity is not mentioned enough on BookTube, at least in my circles, because living here, we have like, you know, there's a book that gets really popular and then everybody's reading it. And in that, like, we also entertain Turkish fiction, because we have Elif Shafak writing 40 Rules of Love, and every person has read that book. But again, that's not really representative of the Western fiction, right?
Well, I think that's something that's relatively new to us as well, like reading Black authors, queer authors, disabled authors, all like
all of the
things.
I do think I've always wanted to read a book by an author from every country. That's sort of always been on my wish list, but that's not the same as reading representatively. And I think there's a consciousness of representative, and I find it really interesting. Sort of started looking at things like what's on my TBR bookshelf, and even buying what I thought was consciously the dominance of white and even male authors in my bookshelf, which I definitely didn't think would be the case, was really striking, and to the point where I've made myself a rule that I'm not buying any cis authors for the next 100 books. I'm about halfway through, but the next 100 books I have to be from people or queer people, just to make sure that my own library is showing a bit of representation, because otherwise you really are led by what is marketed to you.
But I think one of the things you've found is it's hard to determine who writes what. Like for example, James Baldwin has a really white sounding name, but he's a Black man, you know, like.
Yeah, but if you look at his titles, I Am Not Your Negro, like, come on.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's often you can like not see, because you don't always have a picture of an author anymore. You can, like, often the work gives it away, but it also, it makes you wonder that when you read literature from Pakistan, for example, are you reading Muslim, Hindu, Zoroastrian, and how different are those? Because I don't have a clue, and that is something that I would love to learn through literature.
I've got to say, I had a fascination when I was a young teen with apartheid in South Africa, and I read a lot of fiction that came out of South Africa. But going and quantifying that as an adult, none of those authors were people of colour. I've read people like Alan Paton, who is a white man, and who wrote important things in the time, but it's very skewed as to the color line in my reading. So I definitely think it's something that you have to be conscious of, whether you're trying to read representatively or not. Knowing the origins of the author that you're reading has to reflect how you take their work.
And I think, like, one of the movements that I've noticed since joining BookTube is a lot of people want what they call own voices. So, you know, if you're reading a book about Black people and it's written by Black people, I think that that's actually something that's really new to the way we think, but is just such a good movement, because, you know, if I'm reading a book by a white man, tell me about being a white man. Don't tell me about being a Black man or being a woman or anything, like, you know, like.
Yeah, right what you know is the old.
Yeah, right what you know. Yeah, exactly. It's exactly. Yeah.
That sounds fascinating, because one thing that you mentioned that I sort of picked up on, that James Baldwin sounds like a white man's name. But for someone who's growing up in this part of the world, they wouldn't know the difference. Like they wouldn't know the difference between what exactly sounds a white name, unless they're like specific names. Maybe you can tell. But someone like James Baldwin and even Alice Walker, like if I saw her books, I wouldn't like it wouldn't click with me that this doesn't sound black or this. So things like that, like it's a nuance that we're not able to pick on because we just see names and they sound different to us. We wouldn't really
Yeah.
we wouldn't be able to tell if this was like a black author or this was a white author. But I'm curious to ask, like, what are some of the Australian books that you would recommend which are actually representative of the country?
I think a book I read earlier in the year, it's a non-fiction book, Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. Bruce Pascoe was raised as a white man, and when he did some genealogy, he found out that he had Aboriginal heritage and became super interested in that. And his book Dark Emu sort of was a little bit of a hand grenade, like politically, because it pointed out how we have misrepresented the Aboriginal people pre being colonialized by white people as being hunter-gatherers, savages, sort of.
Yeah, that's a horrible word. But very much, even like modern primary school, high school education paints this picture of Aboriginal people as a nomadic, very unorganized, I guess, civilization that is tribal and not structured. And Dark Emu is sort of an expose of that idea as just being completely incorrect, and a discussion of the fact that the reason we're taught this idea is because Australia was founded on the idea of terra nullius, which is the declaration by the British that there was no government here.
There are no people here.
Yeah, no people here.
No people here.
Which obviously completely erases the native people. And all of this that we are taught about our first people is to sort of reinforce the idea that they weren't settled, they weren't proper, they weren't real people,
And it contradicts a lot. Like one of the things it goes into is agriculture and farming that Aboriginal people did, and it completely contradicts what I was taught at school. Yeah. And so that's fascinating to learn about that. But other books I would recommend would be, I guess, your favorite author, Tim Winton, is so over the top Aussie.
He's very, I mean, he's a white Australian, but he's an environmentalist. He's an activist, and so a lot of his writing is rooted in the geography and the landscape, and his description of Australia is very evocative. It is if you want to know what it's like to be in the summer in Australia, then read anything by Tim Winton and you'll get an image and a feeling for what it's like to be here. Whether you like his fiction or not is a matter of taste, but his images are spectacular and do sort of give you a bit of a flavour for what Australian life is like. I don't really read a lot of Australian fiction, to be honest.
I must confess, the fiction that is marketed to us tends to come from really two places, America or the UK, or maybe Canada gets grouped in with America and marketed together, but maybe that's it.
Yeah. There's not too many big Australian authors, I guess.
Yeah. I really think that Tim Winton is probably the...
Yeah, Tim Winton is who we get taught at in school and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that makes me really interesting in both of the books and Tim Winton as an author, but especially I think you mentioned Dark Emu and Nonfiction November is coming up, so that's a book that's definitely on my radar, because also like in our history we don't really study about Australia. Like it's either all of concentrated in Pakistan or it's about the British, and even American history. Like I didn't study the details of American history or how it came into being up until I was in university when I was taking a course on American politics. So a lot of our history is so localized that we don't actually realize how much is going on in the other countries. But also, like, one thing that, you know, how I always have this, like, the British kind of messed everything for Pakistan and India. Actually, I hear you talk about Australia. A lot of, like, the erasure of history and to portray their own voices. Like, a lot of our history tends to be very similar because colonization was basically civilizing the people who weren't essentially white. Like, it was basically a phrase that I would come up in my courses a lot was the white man's burden. Like, nobody asked you to come here, but like the point of you know, the responsibility of civilizing and wherever, like, it's all over in Africa, it's in Asia, it's like parts of it. So I found it really interesting, and that's a book that I would definitely be on the lookout for. But another Pakistani non-fiction book, now that you talk about non-fiction, I would recommend is called The Sensational Life and Death of Nelle Baloch. But it's basically about the social media celebrity that we had, and she was referred to as Pakistan's Kim Kardashian. And I've done a review for this a couple of years ago, not my best video, but you know, I refused to take it down because I really liked what I had to say in that. So it's basically about Pakistan's first social media celebrity, and she did a lot of like provocative content, and a lot of people were really, you know, she riled people up. People didn't really like that, you know, she was being different, and you know, she was wearing all these clothes which were not socially acceptable. She was saying things that would really make people angry, and unfortunately she had like a very tragic demise because her own brother ended up killing her in the name of honor. And it was basically, the book was all about how the media treated her. So it wasn't just about the concept of honor killing, but what led to it, like all the social media rise and fame and everything. So that's like one of the best Pakistani books that I've read in the last couple of years, because it not only victimizes her, like she's still there as very much as a person and her social media celebrity. She came from a very poor background. It was all, and then she was trying to make a name for herself, essentially. But like a lot of people didn't really like what she was doing, and they felt threatened. They thought that she was bringing shame upon the family. And that book really captures the essence of not only her circumstances and where she came from, but also like how much the media had a role in like sort of propagating her murder, because they were just tearing her down constantly. She would be interviewed and constantly insulted by hosts that, oh, look what you're doing, kind of a thing. So that's one book that I would really, really recommend. And I feel like it just came out in America last year or maybe this year. It's called A Woman Like Her. So it's under different titles in different countries. So I think that's like a really interesting one to check out.
That sounds super
It
interesting.
does sound super interesting.
It sounds a little bit like new culture and young and old culture sort of clashing, and new ideas and old ideals clashing as well.
Yeah, and there's clearly some feminist issues in there as well, which I think there's, that's on the list.
That sounds delicious, actually.
Yeah, it sounds really good. I also think it's really interesting how they changed the names of books for different markets, and I never understand why.
I asked the author actually because I follow her on Instagram. So, and I like, it's an interesting point. In Pakistan, it was published as The Sensational Life and Death of Nelle Baloch. And that's the social media name that she took on because she didn't really want to reveal her own identity because, you know, again, it was a question of safety. So when it came out, this was the title of the book. And then when it came out in America as A Woman Like Her, like I messaged the author on Instagram. I was like, I saw this, I'm just kind of curious. And I wasn't really expecting her to respond. And she said that in the American market, they wanted to focus on the story because a lot of people wouldn't recognize the name. Like they wouldn't know who Nelle Baloch in person was. So they said A Woman Like Her because, you know, people, if you put the name, then people wouldn't be interested. But if you say A Woman Like Her, that sort of tends to get more attention because the average American who's trying to look for books wouldn't really be interested in a biography or a memoir, whatever their perception is. But if you take the name off and you make a generic title and you talk about like the social media star who was killed, that sort of tends to get more of their attention.
It sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me, but it also sounds like you're like the social media star who was killed by her family. That could be
a thriller.
but it could be anybody. It's sort of almost erasing the Pakistani identity from
making it
from
more
the book as
palatable
well,
for the white people.
which I hope that's not part of it. Like, I hope that's just an accident, but
yeah, I mean, like, honestly, I'm sure it is part of it. I'm sure that there are trends that show that, you know, Americans buy less books with ethnic sounding names. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's horrible trends like that.
But like, it doesn't matter which way. It sounds like an excellent book.
It does.
It's definitely a really, really good nonfiction I would recommend. There's also this other book of essays. It's called Points of Entry. I read it very recently. But it's basically for a local audience, because this person, it's kind of like a travel log. He travels to different parts of the country, and he emphasizes on, like, even before the British Empire or the Mughal rule, like 13th, 14th century, like what the place of the history was. And he talks about like the Indus Valley civilization. And that's another like very interesting book of essays that I read recently in the nonfiction category, which I thought was really, really done well.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
I think that I don't read enough nonfiction. I think that the more we talk, the closer it gets to November, and the more we talk about the nonfiction titles, I'm like, oh, so many. There's so many, and I've looked at my shelves, and I've got about 20, and I can't read 20 books in a month. So.
You can try.
I can try, but I've clearly been saving them all for November.
I think that's one of the things about BookTube readathons is like you sort of save the titles that you have for those readathons, but you know, you're not going to read 20 nonfictions in November.
No.
Yeah.
But I also think I don't realize how much I enjoy nonfiction.
It's so fascinating, and there's so many topics, you know. Like,
there's so much to learn, and that's part of why I like to read, is to learn.
So I kind of wanted to ask, what are some of your favorite like funny comedic books that you would recommend?
I adore PG Wodehouse rather, who is like a classic. He's probably you know, his work's probably over 100 years old, some of it now, but he wrote the Jeeves and Wooster books, which are set in England, and is about Wooster is like this ridiculously upper class rich man who doesn't need to work, and Jeeves is his butler, who is ridiculously smart, and Wooster gets into all sorts of scrapes that are not really scrapes by anybody's standard other than his, and Jeeves always comes up with a way to manipulate it, and that's I enjoy that series. I enjoy Wodehouse generally because he's not too serious. But the other two, though, I really recommend, and they're both classics as well, is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, which is, it's actually a really sad story. He committed suicide, and his mother found this book in his attic, and then she like gave it to a publisher and like pleaded with the publisher to read it, and the publisher said, I'll read the first few pages to make this lady happy, and then I won't publish it. And anyway, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's like this hilarious literary comedy where like the main character, sorry, my dog's trying to play tug with me while I'm talking, so if I'm shaking, that's what's happening.
Dog's trying to drag him from the room. Come and play.
I'm just trying to keep him quiet. But yeah, like the main character is just this parody of society, and then he picks on society, and at one point, like he's unhappy with his boss, so instead of like complaining about it, he plots a military coup to take over his boss. Like it's ridiculous. And the other one is Catch-22, which is such a funny book, but it's I think this is so good because it's an anti-war book, and it balances this like absurd comedy with the serious, but it does it in a way that is true to both, which is, and it points out how silly war is essentially. So that would be what I would recommend to people as a start for reading funny.
I've got to say, I don't read many straight comedies, but I like books like that have a funny side, and I think that we forget that humor is a big part of most really good writers. the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood I read earlier this year, and it's a very serious dystopian book about, you know, what we're doing to our planet and the effects of capitalism on the environment and human beings and our souls. But the last book of the trilogy, all I did was laugh the whole way through. Just laugh out loud joyously. It was so funny, and she's just built in this humor to make her subject matter easier to bear, I think. But but it's just, I think a really good writer can make you laugh the whole way through.
Yeah, for sure. So now I'm interested in all of these books that you mentioned, because a confederacy of dances is something that really like comes up. Like, you know of that a book with this title exists, but you wouldn't really know if like what the content is. And I feel like booktube discussions also bring up a lot of like backlist books that you somewhere in your head you know that they exist, but you would never think of picking them up until someone talks about it in such an interesting way, and then you're like, you know, I could possibly read this. Someone the other day was talking about Roots by Alex Haley, and like that's a book that I know of, like from when I was like I've heard of this, but I heard like a newer, fresher voice talk about it in a way that sounded appealing, and I was like, maybe I would really like to read that. One book that I not recently, but a few years ago I read, it was called The Suicide Shop. And it's basically a dark comedy about this family that runs a suicide shop, which basically means that they sell you everything that you could possibly need to kill yourself. And it's a little over 100 pages, and it's one of the funniest books I've read because, you know, they have a child running the shop, and the child says, "Oh, well, let's see you soon." And the parents are like, "That's not what we do. Like, you know, we're running the business of like telling them to have a nice day or see you soon." So that's a book that I really like, and I think it's just, you know, it's hilarious.
That sounds amazing.
And 100 pages, I'm in.
You can't say no to a book that's 100 pages long.
That's it. Even if it's terrible, it's not a waste of time.
Yeah, I think one thing that I think marketers do is with comedy and with thriller and with fantasy is they tend to like market single genre, and all of those things can have literary components, can have, you know, so many other components. You can have a historical fiction that's also a thriller, and but like, because we're living in a, you know, a capitalist world, we've just got to get to the point quickly and go, oh yeah, it's a comedy.
Yeah, they've got to know where to put it, which shelf to put it on.
But you know, the idea of having literary comedy or something like that, it's just,
yeah. I think that it's probably something that the marketing is going to have to evolve, because we have access to so much more information about the books that we choose to buy now. Like, you can go on BookTube and find someone else who's read it and get a better description. And even Goodreads has, you know, loads of information. You're no longer just going by what's in the blurb and where it's stacked in the bookshelf. You know, I'm not going to stand. Everyone's got their phone out in the bookstore, you know, doing a little bit more research. And I think that they will eventually adapt their marketing to be a bit more nuanced, I think.
At least we can hope that's what happens.
yes.
For that. So I think that brings our conversation to a close for today, at least, because I would like to do another one of these videos. This was so much fun for me. I had like a really good time.
I would love to do another one.
But thank you so much for coming on my channel, and I mean, this will go on both our channels, but for agreeing to this, because I thought it would be interesting to talk to you guys. I love your videos, and I'll have Gunpowder, I'm getting it wrong again, Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, their YouTube channel and their Instagram linked below for anyone who wants to check them out.
Thank you so much for asking us and having us on your channel. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'd love to do this again.
Yeah, this is fun.
So thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.
Bye.